Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I studied chemistry at the university in Turin because I loved how precise it was. My father was a professor, my mother a teacher. We spent evenings reading together in our small apartment that smelled like old books and my mother's cooking. Then 1943 came and the rules stopped mattering. They came for us in December. My mother didn't cry when they knocked. She just looked at me and my sister and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. We were Jewish, and that was enough. I ended up in Auschwitz. I won't describe it. If you know, you know. If you don't, I hope you never have to understand what it means to stop being a person and become a number instead. I survived because I was a chemist. They needed chemists in the factory, so I worked there. I also survived because I was lucky, and because I was young, and because on some days I simply refused to die out of spite. When the camp was liberated, I walked home. It took months. I won't talk about that either. After the war, I went back to chemistry. I got a job at a paint factory outside Turin. I wrote about what happened because someone had to, but mostly I just tried to live like a normal person again. I married, I had children, I worked. The factory did business all over Europe, including Germany. Because I spoke German, they sent me there often for consultations and meetings. My German was functional, but it was strange. I'd learned it in the camp from the guards and the other prisoners, so it was rough. Military German, barracks German, the kind of German you use when you're being shouted at or trying not to get killed. One trip, I was in Frankfurt for a technical conference about synthetic resins. The conference was fine. Germans are very organized about these things. On the second day, during a coffee break, I was standing by the refreshments when a man approached me. He was about my age, well-dressed, with that confident way Germans have when they're on their home territory. He complimented my German but said there was something unusual about my accent. He asked where I had learned it. I was stirring my coffee. I didn't look up. I told him I learned it in Auschwitz. The change was immediate. His face went completely blank. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He stammered something about the weather being quite mild that week and walked away quickly. I watched him go and took a sip of my coffee. It happened again a few months later in Munich. I was meeting with technical staff at a chemical company. We were discussing polymer formulations. One of the engineers, a friendly man who'd been very helpful, asked me over lunch where I'd picked up my German. I told him I learned it in Auschwitz. He put down his fork. He stared at his plate. He said something about the soup being very good and asked if I'd tried it. He didn't make eye contact with me for the rest of the meal. The third time was in Hamburg. I was doing a consultation for a company that manufactured industrial paints. The owner was a man in his 60s, very proud of his business, very eager to show me around the facility. We were walking through the factory floor when he commented on my language skills. He said I spoke German well for an Italian and asked if I'd studied it in school. I told him no, that I learned it in Auschwitz. He stopped walking. For a moment I thought he might say something, but he just cleared his throat several times and started talking very quickly about the ventilation system. He kept a physical distance from me for the rest of the day. It became almost routine. Someone would ask about my German, curious about the odd accent, the military formality of it. I would tell them the truth. They would immediately find something else to talk about. The weather, the food, the quality of German engineering, anything except what I just said. I understood why. What were they supposed to say? They couldn't ask questions because the questions would be horrible. They couldn't express sympathy because what sympathy is adequate. They couldn't apologize because how do you apologize for that? So they changed the subject and I let them because I wasn't trying to make them uncomfortable. I was just answering their question honestly. The last time it happened was in Berlin, at a symposium on industrial chemistry. I was presenting a paper on chromium compounds. Afterward, during the reception, a younger man approached me. He couldn't have been more than 30. He complimented my presentation and then, inevitably, asked about my German. I told him I learned it in Auschwitz. This time, though, something different happened. He didn't look away. He looked directly at me, and his face went very pale. He told me he was sorry. He said he didn't know what else to say except that he was sorry. I told him there was nothing else to say. We stood there for a moment in silence. Then he nodded and walked away. I finished my wine and left the reception early. I had a train to catch back to Turin, back to my family, back to my work mixing pigments and writing formulas, back to my life which I'd somehow managed to keep despite everything. The German I learned in Auschwitz got me through those business trips. It helped me do my job. It also ended conversations very efficiently. I never meant it as a weapon, but I suppose the truth often works that way. When my mother died 15 years ago, she left me her house. It was a small two-bedroom place where I grew up. By that time, my husband and I had already bought a larger home across town. We talked about what to do with the property and decided renting it out made the most sense. The mortgage was completely paid off, so whatever we charged for rent was pure profit. We found decent tenants over the years and it brought in about $1,200 a month. My husband and I met Sam and George back in college. We stayed close over the decades, celebrating holidays together and watching our kids grow up side by side. Our son just turned 24 last month. He's working on his master's degree in engineering while working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop. Sam's son is 23 and studying computer science while working part-time at a bookstore. George's daughter is 24 and finished her graduate program in marketing back in May. She landed her first real corporate job in July and was excited to finally be earning a real salary. The three of them decided to move in together about a year ago. They found a place in the old industrial district downtown where rent was cheap. My husband and I visited once and immediately felt uneasy about the area. The building had sketchy people hanging around outside at all hours. But the kids wanted their independence, and this was what they could afford on their limited budgets. We tried to be supportive even though we worried constantly. Then things started going downhill fast. Someone broke into the laundry room in the basement and stole clothes from the dryers. A few weeks later, another tenant's car got broken into right in the parking lot. Then one evening I stopped by to drop off some groceries for my son. The front door to the building was hanging open with the lock completely smashed. Anyone could just walk right into the building. I asked the woman leaving if management knew about it. She laughed and said management didn't care about anything unless it affected their ability to collect rent. I went upstairs and found the kids in their apartment. They tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see the worry in their faces. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that broken lock and how vulnerable they were. Around 2 in the morning I shook my husband awake. I told him I had an idea about the rental house. What if we let the kids live there instead? They could cover the utilities and bills, but we wouldn't charge them actual rent. My husband sat up and rubbed his eyes. He asked if I was sure about giving up that income. I told him the house brought in about $1,200 a month, but our peace of mind was worth more than that. We didn't really need the extra money anyway. He thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before agreeing completely. The next morning I called our son and explained the offer. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I was serious. I told him completely serious. The three of them could move into the house if they split the bills evenly between them. No rent, just utilities, internet, water, electricity, and things like that. He said he needed to talk to his roommates first. Within 2 hours, all three of them called me back, practically shouting with excitement and gratitude. I spent the next few days drawing up a proper lease agreement. I wasn't just going to do this on a handshake. The lease specified that all bills had to be paid by the 5th of each month. They needed to maintain the property and keep it clean. They couldn't move anyone else in without written approval from me and agreement from all current tenants. Any damage beyond normal wear and tear would be their responsibility to pay for. The lease would be reviewed and renewed every 12 months. Most importantly, if anyone failed to pay their portion of bills or violated any terms, they would face eviction. I made it crystal clear this included my own son. No special treatment just because he was mine. I also transferred $5,000 into a separate savings account for emergency repairs. We updated the insurance policy on the house to make sure we were covered for everything. I called Sam first to let him know about the arrangement. He was immediately supportive and actually thanked me for looking out for his son. He said he'd been losing sleep over that neighborhood too. His wife called me later that same day to express her gratitude as well. Then I called George. The conversation did not go well. He asked what I was talking about when I started explaining. I told him we were letting the 3 kids move into our rental property. They'd cover all the bills but wouldn't pay rent. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he asked if I'd done this without consulting him first. I said I hadn't thought to consult anyone since they were all adults making their own decisions. George's voice got tight. He explained that one of his main reasons for wanting his daughter to move out was to teach her financial responsibility. He'd told her she needed to start paying rent if she wanted to keep living at home. She'd responded by saying if she was paying rent anyway, she'd rather have her own place. Now George felt like I was completely undermining the lesson he'd been trying to teach her. I pointed out that she would still have financial responsibilities. The 3 of them would be splitting utilities, which in that house usually ran around $300 a month. Add an internet, water, trash service, and they'd each be paying close to $150 monthly. Plus they'd be buying all their own food and handling their own expenses. George said that was nothing compared to real rent. He said I was spoiling them and preventing them from learning what the real world was like. I told him I was keeping them safe. That neighborhood was dangerous and getting worse. George said safety wasn't the point. The point was teaching responsibility and independence. Then he told me he wanted me to tell his daughter she couldn't live there. I was stunned. He wanted me to kick out just his daughter while letting my son and Sam's son stay. I told him absolutely not. I'd made an offer to all 3 of them as a group. Going back on it now and singling out his daughter would be cruel and unfair. George said I was teaching her she could just run to someone else whenever his rules didn't suit her. I reminded him his daughter was 24 years old. She had a master's degree and a full-time job making $45,000 a year. She wasn't a child anymore. George said that didn't matter. He said as long as he was her father, she owed him respect and should follow his guidance. I told him his guidance stopped being mandatory when she became an adult. He could offer advice, but he couldn't control her choices anymore. The conversation went in circles for another 10 minutes before George hung up on me. That evening, my husband came home and I filled him in on everything. He listened quietly, then said maybe we should have run it by George first. I asked why we would need George's permission to offer our property to an adult woman. He said because she was George's daughter, and he was clearly trying to parent her in a specific way. I asked if he thought we should have gotten Sam's permission too. He admitted probably not, but Sam wasn't actively trying to teach his son a financial lesson. I told him that was George's problem to figure out with his daughter. We weren't obligated to enforce his parenting philosophy on a grown woman with a career. My husband dropped it after that, though I could tell he was uncomfortable with the tension. The kids gave notice at their apartment and moved into the house 3 weeks later. They sent us constant updates through the whole process. Pictures of them loading the moving truck. Photos of each room as they unpacked. Our son sent a picture of all 3 of them sitting on the front porch with huge smiles. The message just said thank you over and over. Seeing them safe and happy made every bit of the drama worthwhile. George stopped speaking to us entirely. No calls, no texts, nothing. We had a neighborhood barbecue planned for the 4th of July that we'd been doing for years. George and his wife didn't show up. Sam told me privately that George had been venting to him about the whole situation. Sam said he'd told George he was being ridiculous, which caused a fight between them too. About 6 weeks after the move, Sam's wife called me. She'd been at a dinner party where George was also a guest. He'd spent half the evening complaining about us to anyone who would listen. He told people we were interfering with his parenting and spoiling not just our own kid, but his daughter too. Sam's wife said most people at the party seemed uncomfortable and didn't really agree with him. One woman had apparently pointed out that his daughter was an adult with a graduate degree. George hadn't liked that comment at all. Around month 3, George's wife reached out to me. We met for coffee at a place halfway between our houses. She looked tired when she sat down. She told me George was still angry, but she wanted me to know she didn't agree with him. She said she was actually relieved their daughter was living somewhere safe. She'd been worried sick about that apartment building too. She thanked me for looking out for her daughter and said she wished her husband would let it go. I told her I understood George felt undermined, but at some point parents had to accept their kids were grown. She agreed completely. The kids thrived in the house. Every month on the 1st, I get a notification that they'd paid the utility bills. Always on time, never late. They kept the place clean and even started doing basic maintenance themselves. My son called one Saturday afternoon to tell me they'd successfully replaced a leaking faucet in the bathroom. He sounded so proud of himself. They'd watched tutorial videos and figured it out together. About 5 months in, George's daughter called me directly. She said she wanted to thank me personally for the opportunity. She'd been saving the money she would have spent on rent. Her student loans had been around $18,000 when she graduated. With her salary and not having to pay rent, she'd been putting $700 a month toward the loans. She was on track to have them completely paid off within a year of graduating. I told her I was proud of her for being so responsible with the opportunity. She said living in the house had actually taught her more about budgeting than paying rent at the old apartment ever did. At the apartment, they'd just paid their portion, and that was it. Now they had to coordinate who paid which bill, make sure everything was covered, and plan ahead for bigger expenses. When the furnace needed a minor repair, they'd all pitched in additional money beyond their normal bills to cover it. She said it felt more like actually managing a household than just being a tenant. Last month marked 6 months since they'd moved in. George finally broke his silence. He called me on a Tuesday evening. His tone was stiff when he told me his daughter had paid off her student loans completely. Apparently, she'd called him that morning to share the news. He admitted the situation had worked out better than he expected. He said he still thought I should have consulted him first. I told him I understood his perspective but stood by my decision. He asked if we could move past this. I said of course we could. The following weekend, George and his wife came to dinner at our house for the first time in months. Things were awkward at first, but by the end of the night we were laughing about old college stories. George never fully apologized for how he'd acted, but he did pull me aside before leaving and admitted maybe he'd been too controlling. He said watching his daughter succeed had made him realize she was more capable than he'd given her credit for. I just nodded and told him she was doing great. Our son called last week with more good news. He and his roommates had decided they wanted to stay in the house after they all finished school. They'd talked about their future plans and realized this arrangement was allowing all of them to save money and build stable lives. Sam's son was saving for a down payment on his own place eventually. George's daughter was now putting money toward retirement accounts. Our son was building an emergency fund and paying down his own smaller student loans. They asked if we'd be willing to extend the lease beyond the 1-year mark. I told them we'd sit down and talk about it when renewal time came up. But honestly, I couldn't imagine saying no. The house was being cared for. The kids were thriving. We were helping 3 young adults get a real start in life. My husband asked me last night if I had any regrets about giving up the rental income. I told him not even for a second. The $1,200 a month was nice, but it wasn't life-changing for us. For those 3 kids, not paying rent was actually life-changing. They were building savings, paying off debt, and learning to manage a household together. George might have wanted to teach his daughter responsibility through rent payments, but she was learning responsibility anyway, just in a different way. And she was doing it while staying safe and building a real financial foundation. That's worth more than any amount of rental income. It's worth more than George's approval too. My neighbor, an older woman I'll call Karen, had always been particular about things. She lived in the house directly next to mine and complained to the homeowners association about people leaving their trash cans out too long, about kids riding bikes too close to her lawn, about everything really. About 6 months ago, things escalated between us over something completely ridiculous. I parked my car on the street just outside my house. It was closer to her driveway than mine, but it wasn't blocking anything. There was still plenty of room for her to pull in and out without any issues. The street parking was public, and I had every right to park there, but Karen didn't see it that way. She started leaving notes on my windshield asking me to move my car. I ignored them at first, thinking she'd eventually let it go. She didn't. The notes became more aggressive, threatening to call the police or have my car towed. I finally went over to talk to her about it one afternoon. I told her I wanted to discuss the notes she'd been leaving on my car. She snapped back that maybe if I'd actually read them and do something about it, she wouldn't have to keep writing them. I explained that I was parking on a public street and wasn't blocking her driveway or doing anything illegal. She insisted I was making it difficult for her to get in and out of her driveway. I pointed out that there was at least 8 feet of clearance, which was more than enough space. She said she didn't care what I thought was enough space and called me inconsiderate and rude. I apologized that she felt that way but stood my ground, telling her I wasn't doing anything wrong and had just as much right to park on the street as anyone else. She slammed the door in my face after that conversation. From then on, she glared at me whenever she saw me outside. I tried to just ignore her and go about my business, but the tension was definitely there. Then came last Tuesday. I'd ordered a new tablet for work, something I've been saving up for. It was a pretty expensive piece of equipment, around $800. I got the notification that it had been delivered around 2 in the afternoon. I was in the middle of a video call with a client, so I couldn't go grab it from the porch right away. I figured it would be fine sitting there for 20 minutes. When I finally went to get the package, it wasn't there. My first thought was that maybe the delivery driver had made a mistake or left it at the wrong house. But then I noticed something weird. There were pieces of cardboard and bubble wrap scattered across my porch, and what looked like fragments of a broken screen. My stomach dropped. I went back inside and checked my doorbell camera footage. What I saw made my blood boil. The video showed the delivery driver dropping off the package at 2:14. At 2:19, Karen came rushing across from her house. She looked around quickly, grabbed my package, and then smashed it repeatedly against my porch railing. The box split open, and she continued to stomp on whatever was inside. Then she gathered up some of the bigger pieces, threw them back on my porch, and ran back to her house with what was left of the tablet. I sat there staring at the screen. This wasn't just theft, this was deliberate destruction of my property, and she'd done it knowing full well what she was doing. I immediately called the police and filed a report. I sent them the footage from my doorbell camera. They said they'd send an officer over to talk to her. About an hour later, I saw 2 police cars pull up in front of Karen's house. I watched from my window as they knocked on her door. She came out looking confused at first, but that quickly changed when they started talking to her. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see her getting more animated, pointing in the direction of my house. One of the officers came to my door afterward to get my statement. He told me they'd spoken with my neighbor and that she'd admitted to taking the package, but claimed she was justified. I asked him how destroying my property could possibly be justified. He explained that she'd said I'd been harassing her by parking my car near her driveway and that she felt like I needed to be taught a lesson. I reminded him that I parked on a public street and wasn't blocking anything. He said they'd explained that to her as well. He also told me they'd explained that what she did was criminal mischief and theft. They'd given her a citation, and I'd need to file a civil suit if I wanted compensation for the damaged property. I asked about the tablet and whether she still had parts of it at her house. He said they'd asked her to return any remaining pieces and that she'd be bringing those over shortly. Sure enough, about 15 minutes after the police left, Karen came over to my house with a bag containing the destroyed remains of my tablet. She didn't say a word, just shoved the bag at me and walked away. I filed a civil suit the next day. My lawyer said it was pretty open and shut given the video evidence. Karen tried to fight it, arguing that I'd provoked her with my parking, but the judge wasn't having it. I was awarded the full cost of the tablet, plus the cost of filing the suit, plus an additional $500 for the emotional distress and my time dealing with the whole situation. I still park my car in the same spot on the street. I've been looking forward to this movie for weeks. The new superhero film everyone was talking about had finally hit theaters, and I'd bought my ticket online 3 days in advance to make sure I got the perfect seat. Center of the row, middle section, optimal viewing angle. I'm particular about these things because I spend most of my workday staring at spreadsheets in a cramped cubicle So when I go out for entertainment, I want it to be perfect. The theater was one of those newer ones with the fancy reclining seats and assigned seating. I appreciated that system because it meant no mad dash to grab a good spot, no saving seats for people who show up late, just find your number and settle in. I got there about 15 minutes before the previews were scheduled to start, grabbed my overpriced popcorn and soda, and headed into the darkened theater. The previews hadn't begun yet, but the lights were already dimmed with just that pre-show entertainment playing on the screen. I made my way down to row G, balancing my snacks, and counted the seats until I reached number 12. Except there was already someone sitting in it. A guy, maybe mid-30s, was sprawled out in my seat with his feet up on the footrest, looking at home. He had a large soda in one cup holder and what looked like nachos in the other. I stood there for a moment, assuming he'd made an honest mistake. I told him I thought he was in my seat. He barely looked at me, taking a long sip of his soda before telling me that, yeah, he knew, but this seat had a better view, so I should just sit somewhere else. I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. The theater was starting to fill up, and I could see other people finding their assigned seats without issue. I told him I'd paid for this specific seat and asked if he could check his ticket. He waved his hand dismissively, not even bothering to look at it. He said he was already settled in and there were plenty of other seats, so I shouldn't make a big deal out of it. I felt my jaw tighten. I'm not usually one for confrontation, but I'd specifically chosen this seat. Plus, what if someone else came and found me in their seat? The whole assigned seating system would fall apart. I insisted I wasn't sitting somewhere else and told him this was my seat, asking him to please move. He asked if I was seriously going to be that person, saying it was just a seat. I repeated that it was my seat, the one I paid for. He rolled his eyes and made an exaggerated show of getting comfortable, adjusting his position in the recliner. He flat out told me he wasn't moving and I should deal with it. Other people in the row were starting to notice the commotion. A couple trying to get to their seats had to wait in the aisle while we had this standoff. I could feel my face getting hot, but I wasn't about to let this guy bully me out of my seat. I turned and walked back up the aisle to find an usher. There was a young guy, probably college age, standing near the entrance with his flashlight. I explained that I needed help because someone was sitting in my assigned seat and refusing to move. He said okay and told me he'd come take a look. We walked back down to row G together. The guy was still sprawled out in my seat, now eating his nachos like he didn't have a care in the world. The usher asked to see his ticket. The guy responded by asking if I'd gotten an usher, sounding incredulous. The usher said he just needed to verify the seat assignment. The guy huffed and pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen before shoving it toward the usher. The usher looked at it, then looked at it again, his eyebrows rising. He told the guy that the ticket was for tomorrow night. Today was Thursday, but the ticket was for Friday. The words hung in the air for a moment. I had a small smile on my face. The guy asked what he meant, saying that couldn't be right. The usher confirmed it said Friday the 9th, right on the ticket. The guy asked if it really mattered since he was already here. The usher said yes, it definitely mattered, and he needed to have a valid ticket for today's showing. The guy said this was ridiculous, and he wasn't leaving because he was already sitting down. The usher's expression shifted from polite to firm. He told the guy he needed to leave the theater because he didn't have a valid ticket for this showing. The guy refused, saying he'd driven all the way here and was going to watch this movie. The usher said if he didn't leave voluntarily, he'd have to get his manager. The guy told him to go ahead and get the manager, calling the whole thing stupid. The usher spoke into his radio and within a minute a woman in a suit appeared. She had that efficient, no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd dealt with difficult customers for years. She asked what the problem was. The usher explained the situation while the guy sat there with his arms crossed, acting like he was the victim in all this. The manager told him he needed to leave and could come back tomorrow for the correct showing. He insisted he wanted to see it now because he was already here. She told him that wasn't how it worked. He needed a valid ticket for today's showing, which he didn't have, so he needed to gather his things. He asked about getting a refund then, saying if they were kicking him out, he should get his money back. The manager's expression didn't change. She explained he'd purchased a ticket for tomorrow's showing which he was still welcome to attend. There was no refund for deciding to come on the wrong day. He said that wasn't fair. She stated those were the terms he'd agreed to when he purchased his ticket, then told him to please leave or she'd have to call security. He finally stood up, grabbing his nachos and soda with jerky, angry movements. He complained loudly that this was the worst customer service he'd ever experienced, and he was never coming back here. The manager simply said that was his choice. He walked up the aisle, talking loudly about how unfair everything was, how he was definitely leaving a bad review online, how this theater had lost a customer. The manager followed him out to make sure he left. The usher turned to me with an apologetic smile and said he was sorry about that, then told me to enjoy my movie. I finally sat down in my seat, the one I'd paid for, and it was just as comfortable as I'd hoped. I got into bartending right after college when I needed money and didn't know what else to do with my English degree. What started as a temporary gig turned into 7 years of working my way up through the industry. I learned everything from scratch, made connections, and eventually helped open several successful bars around the city. People knew my name in the scene, and I was proud of what I'd built. About 2 years ago, my friend approached me at one of the bars where I was working. We'd known each other since high school, stayed in touch over the years. Nothing super close, but friendly enough. He told me he'd been thinking about getting into the bar business and asked if I'd been doing it for a while. I confirmed I'd been bartending for about 7 years and asked why he wanted to know. He explained he was thinking bigger than just bartending. He said him and a couple other guys were looking at buying that old music venue downtown, the one on 5th Street. I knew it well. The place had been struggling for years, cycling through different owners and concepts. It had good bones though, a solid location, with a built-in crowd from the local music scene. He went on to explain they wanted to rebrand it and make it something special, but he admitted none of them knew anything about running a bar, so he was hoping I could help them get it off the ground. He laid out what sounded like a solid offer: good pay, a percentage of the profits, creative control over the bar operations. I'd handle everything on the beverage side while they dealt with the business and booking aspects. It seemed like a great opportunity to put my experience to use and potentially build something I could be proud of. I should have known better. From day one, things were messy. I spent weeks designing the entire point of sale system from scratch, making sure it could handle both bar sales and ticket sales efficiently. I interviewed and hired every single bartender, trained them personally, set up all the vendor relationships, created the inventory system, built out the menu. I set up the entire bar operation while the owners fumbled through learning how to book bands. The problem started immediately. My first paycheck was 2 weeks late. When I asked about it, they acted like I was being unreasonable. One of the other owners told me they were a startup and I needed to be more flexible about these things. I pointed out that I had rent due and we'd agreed on payment dates. The third owner chimed in saying that, yeah, but I'd also agreed to be part of a team, and teams work together. That became the pattern. Paychecks always late, always an excuse. They'd call me at 3 in the morning asking questions they could have Googled. They'd override my decisions about staffing and inventory, then blame me when things went wrong. They started taking credit for the systems I built, telling people they'd designed everything themselves. The final straw came about 6 months in. I've been working 60-hour weeks trying to keep the place running while they focused on the fun parts of owning a venue, showing up to watch bands and drink for free. They owed me thousands of dollars in back pay at that point. I told them I needed what they owed me or I was done. My friend asked if I was really going to abandon them like this after everything they'd done for me. I shot back asking what they'd done for me, pointing out that I'd built the entire operation. The second owner said that wasn't how they remembered it, claiming I'd actually been pretty difficult to work with. That's when I realized they were going to screw me over completely. I walked out that night and never went back. Over the next few weeks, I heard through mutual friends that they were spreading stories about me, saying I'd stolen from them, that I was unreliable, that I'd tried to sabotage the business. Complete lies, but enough to damage my reputation in a small industry where everyone knows everyone. I tried to move on, Got another bartending gig across town, tried to forget about the whole mess. They never paid me what they owed, and I didn't have the money to lawyer up over it. Then a few weeks ago, I was cleaning out old apps on my phone and found something interesting. When I'd set up the bar's lighting and automation systems, I'd install the control app on my phone for testing purposes. I'd completely forgotten about it. Out of curiosity, I opened it. Everything was still there. All the controls for the lights, the music system, the timers. They'd never removed my access. They probably didn't even know how. I sat there looking at my phone, thinking about all the money they owed me, all the lies they'd spread. A smile crept across my face. The following Saturday night, around 9 o'clock, I opened the app. The bar wasn't too busy yet according to the system status. I started with something subtle, just dimming the main bar lights down to 20%, then back up. The app told me it was successful. I waited 5 minutes, then did it again. Then I switched all the lights to red, then blue, then shut them completely off. Through the app, I could see them killing the main power. All the devices went offline. A few minutes later, everything came back on. I let them think they'd fixed it, waited until they'd probably relaxed, then started the whole cycle again. Off, on, purple, green, strobe mode, off again. I spent 30 glorious minutes watching them panic through my phone screen. I could picture them flipping breakers, checking connections, completely baffled about what was happening to their system. The system I'd built, the system they'd taken credit for. I decided not to overdo it that first night. I didn't want them getting too suspicious too quickly. But before I closed the app, I set up something special. Automatic timers for every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night. At exactly 12 midnight, when the bar would be packed and the drinks would be flowing, all the main bar area lights would shut off completely. The upstairs dance floor would stay lit because I'm not a monster, but the entire bar area where people order drinks would go pitch black. Every single weekend. They'll figure it out eventually, probably. They'll have to pay someone to rebuild the entire system from scratch. That'll cost them thousands of dollars. Money they owe me. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.